David here with Figboot.pens. At the recent Triangle Pen Show, I had the chance to sit down with Jonathon Brooks of the Carolina Pen Company. Jonathon has made a name for himself in the pen world on several fronts. He makes some amazing acrylics. He's an awesome custom pen maker. And lately, he's been working a great deal with a variety of urushi finishes. Now, I will say that the audio for this interview isn't quite perfect. It's a little echoey. It's not too bad, but off enough just to bug me a bit. We were in a cramped little meeting room and the acoustics weren't so hot, so forgive that, please. But in the end, I think that it was a nice conversation and really an opportunity to get a bit inside of a head of an innovator and a craftsman. So I hope you enjoy it. So here you go, my conversation with Jonathon Brooks. So I'm here with Jonathon Brooks, owner of the Carolina Pen Company. How you doing?
Pleasure to be here, David.
We're here at the Triangle Show, and what we wanted to do is get a lot of background on some of your history and where you came from, and then I really wanted to do some focus on a lot of your urushi work, which seems like It's kind of been a focus of yours lately.
Oh, absolutely, it has been.
So now, I understand that you got started making kit pens, or kind of turning your own pens a number of years ago.
That's right. It started around 2008, and what I really wanted to do was get into bowl turning. And
like bolts, like
no, like decorative lathe bowls.
Oh, bowls. I think
yes,
you said bolts.
And so I called a company that was local that provided classes on this. Yeah. And it wasn't for several more months, but they said we have a pen kit turning class that weekend if you like to get your feet wet if you've never worked with a lathe before. So my wife Shay and I, we decided to take the class and was instantly hooked. It was something that was going to be a hobby, something to do on the weekend, here and there. And it quickly snowballed into not a business, but just a hobby that we just started instantly being addicted to. Mm-hmm. Every day you can turn a different material into a pen. But then I quickly got bored with the store-bought acrylics and the kits because they're all the same everywhere you look. So then I started developing how to create my own resins and colors and pigments and started doing that.
So how do you go from, hey, I see this in the store, I don't like it, to I'm going to go just create my own?
It just kind of happened, honestly. It was one of those, I have to do something different. I was getting somewhat bored, and it was the next creative outlet for me. And then that quickly snowballed into a full-fledged business that I still do today, making materials, providing them to pen makers worldwide, and now some pen manufacturers as well.
I think I mentioned earlier in the review, or in my review of one of your pens earlier, mm-hmm. that if you have a custom pen out there, that there's a good chance, if it's really cool acrylic, that it's your acrylic without even anyone knowing it.
That's right. There is a good possibility for that.
Yeah. And it's not like people are hiding that or hiding where it's coming from. It's just, you're the one supplying a lot of this amazing acrylic to a number of different smaller pen manufacturers.
Absolutely, yeah.
And things like your work that you've done with the Carolina Pen Company, mm-hmm. I think is some of your best work when it comes to acrylic.
Yes.
When you go to create something like that that has some inspiration behind it, is that slightly different than just creating something of your own mind? Or
to a degree, because it's for Hugh and Carol, it was their inspiration that I have to help bring to life versus my own inspiration from my head through my hands. And it can become somewhat troublesome, but at the same time, I have enough experience with how the colors will play together to encapsulate that image in resin.
Cool, and I think they turned out amazing.
Thank you.
So you're successful in creating acrylics for the industry, and then turning your own pens, and then you decide that's not enough, and you want to take on the ancient Japanese art of urushi. What led to that?
So when I became bored with the kit style pens, I moved further into the resin making side of things for a couple of years. And around 2011, I wanted to get into the full-fledged custom pen making where you do pretty much everything yourself. And with that, one of the major inspirations were the Japanese pens, the Nakayas, the Danny Trios. And it was not just the shapes that they used, but also the lacquer work. I mean, it was so beautiful how the artistry they can do, creating all these images on top of a pen, it was just so masterful. That's really what led me to start my research into it.
Now, one of the things that you hear a lot about, and what we'll do is we'll kind of look at some examples of some of this and go over some of the process, but the one thing you hear is that it takes months and months and months to do all of these applications and things along those lines. Have you found that that is essentially true, or have you been able to kind of discover, I don't want to say shortcuts or alternative techniques that can get you the same look without taking you 6 months to make a single pen?
Right. The ones that take 6 months or longer are the ones that are so intricate and detailed, where you have to be so meticulous with each placement of either the abalone or mother of pearl, the gold flakes, or the design itself. If it's a dragon, you have to paint each individual spot, sprinkle it with your gold powders, and repeat the process many times, and that adds to the length. But it is still true that to create these pens with the lacquer work, it does take several months, because every layer has to be applied super thin, has to be cured at a very specific heat and humidity level for a minimum of 24 hours. I usually go 36, sometimes 48 hours in between, just because of life and work schedules. You then have to sand that layer, reapply, recure, and some pens have anywhere from 20 to 50 layers sometimes.
And you had to, I remember you saying you bought a humidifier so you have a humidifier in your house so that you can keep things at the right temperature and humidity.
That's right. I have I now have 3 homemade curing chambers just to help with the demand. And inside each chamber has a container of water, a water-soaked rag, and I can't think of the name of the tool that measures your heat and humidity at the same time. But to provide the heat, since it's inside my house, well, it's AC controlled. In summertime, it's not going to be at optimum temperatures. In the wintertime, it's going to be too warm. I have a terrarium heat pad that I can adjust the heat levels to, so I can dial in the perfect numbers no matter what temperature in the house.
Now, are these things specifically made for curing a variety of things, or are you literally kind of jerry-rigging this together and creating something?
Yes, we call it Southern ingenuity.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to work.
There's no Urushi store you go to just go buy all your supplies? And
No. I wish there were, but no, unfortunately not. And with mentioning Urushi stores, I do purchase all my lacquer straight from Japan. Yeah. And learning Urushi and how to work with it, I spent a year researching every aspect I possibly could, because there is no tutorials or online guides or worksheets written in English. So it was a lot of Google Translate before it was the easy one-click, translate a whole page of text. It was copy-paste for a year, compiling my information, cross-referencing, trying what I'm reading to see if it actually works or not. So I spent a year research and then almost another year trial and error, making sure my methodology was accurate.
And how readily available are the materials? Because not only is it time, it takes a lot of time in order to create the product, but I believe that the material itself is not necessarily inexpensive.
Oh, absolutely not. A container of 50 grams of the high-quality Japanese lacquer can run anywhere from $180 to $250.
And roughly how much of that, I can imagine it varies depending on the pen, but so that 50 grams, how much is that, like 1 pen, 5 pens, 10 pens?
Probably 10 or more pens.
Yeah.
Because you're using a pea-sized drop of lacquer, because it has to be applied so thinly. Mm-hmm. So like I said, around a pea-sized drop will coat a cap, a body, in a grip section one time. So that times 50 through multiple pens, you usually go through it pretty quickly.
Now, I've heard that there's some applications to where they apply the Urushi and then literally just like wipe it right off.
Yes.
As opposed to other ones where you apply it and then let it build up.
And those are the ones that are heartbreaking to do, because that's one of the more expensive varieties of the lacquer.
Yeah.
and I know how to spell the word for it. I don't know how to pronounce it accurately, so I'm not going to. But it is essentially you brush it on or wipe it on, let it set for a few minutes, and all it's doing is going into any micropores on the surface, and you wipe off every bit of excess there is, and then you allow it to cure, and you do that for usually 5 to 7 days straight. And then what that does is it'll harden the surface of the pen at the end of the finishing of the end of the lacquer work to harden, allowing it to be polished to that high gloss that you see.
Well, let's take a look at some of your pens, and we can kind of talk about the different techniques that go into those. So what do you want to take a look at first here?
We'll start with one that's a little bit more on the, I won't say basic, but on the more traditional side. So this one is, it's not quite a traditional Tominary finish, but it is still somewhat. It's more of a gradient effect. A typical Tominary finish would have a solid base color, which is the orange on this pen, and then a translucent top coat. And that's where the Tominary comes in. The Tomi, I believe, stands for deep pool. So that's where the translucency and the depth is there, and Nuri just means coating or application. And so we have, like I said, we have the orange on the bottom layer, and then this is a translucent orange. It looks red because of the depth of it. And on the edges and around the top, you can still see some of the orange showing through the surface.
Now, how do you get it? When you get, like, there's some pens that have the edges, or some like the decapods and things like that,
right.
where they'd have, let's say, on the edges of the pen there are the lighter amount. Is that because it's been buffed down, or because it's been polished down, and you kind of go through the one layer?
Exactly. You're purposely, the way I do it is you're purposely sanding a little bit further down through the top finish towards your edges, which is a natural progression of sanding anyway, because you're always going to roll over your edges anyhow when you're sanding, and you'll expose your edges before you'll ever expose your center, and that's just kind of the natural beauty of it.
One thing I noticed here, and I think we'll see it in in some of the other pens, is that you have not just one urushi technique, that you have a multitude of techniques.
Oh, absolutely. Let's see, what's a good one for that? This one will be a good example. So there's not a traditional name for this style. This is something I won't say I invented, because I altered a traditional technique for this.
Yeah.
But essentially it is the same. The red that you see is the solid color base layer. And then for the top layer, the black, it is opaque. It's not see-through. There's no showing through the surface. But it is texture on top. You can feel the difference in the layers. And how it's done is, through my research, I figured out how they do one technique. It's again, I can't pronounce the traditional wording of it, but it stands for dragonfly wing pattern, and it looks like a tightly woven fishnet draped over the entire surface, and they usually apply gold powders or silver powders to that layer. And this is an alternative way of doing it, to where the pattern is more abstract, more random, and thicker, and it's allowed to. So the way it's done is I make a solution of urushi, the distilled turpentine, which is what's used to thin it or clean, and denatured alcohol, which is a dispersing agent, and you float it on top of water, and it'll separate and then come back together, and like I said, random patterns every single time, and then you would take and you would dip each piece of the pen through the water, and only the lacquer will stick. The water will evaporate off, and you let it cure.
I think I've seen them, how they do like some camouflage patterns and things like that. So in essence, the paint's sitting on top of the water, and you're dipping it into the water, and so it kind of creates a more flowing natural pattern, and then when you lift it up, it kind of, or actually when you're inserting, it sticks to it.
Exactly.
And you bring it up, and then you have your finish.
Yeah, here in America, hydro dipping is another way of thinking of it, or a lot of guitar makers will use spray paint over a 55-gallon drum of water and the paint will float on the water, and they'll dip their pieces into it. It's a very similar technique.
So now, if you're using that technique, is that, we'll say, easier because, I don't want to say it just took an hour or 15 minutes, but all of a sudden you're just dipping it and you're done, as opposed to applying layers and layers and layers, and so this is a much quicker process than some of the others? Is that what I'm assuming?
To a degree, yes, because all you're doing is your base coat layers, which again will be 10 to 15 layers of the solid red to allow, because you basically have to make a finished pen before you ever get to the stage with the secondary color. So yes, this part will still take you, the red part will still take you a couple months, because you still have to do the final hardening, polishing, gloss finish, everything. And then you do the stage with the top layer, the black. But because you're traditionally you're supposed to do super thin layers, well, this black layer, in the hand, you can feel the thickness of that layer. So this is much thicker than you would normally apply. So you have to cure it longer, but you also have to adjust your heat and humidity slightly, because if it cures too quickly, it'll wrinkle up like a raisin. And you'll have this really ugly prune-like skin to it.
I think I've seen it with globs of paint sometimes that sometimes they can get. So how does that compare to something like this one here that in a way kind of looks like it has the same technique, but then just more polished down as opposed to the textured look?
Right. So to make this one, I essentially do the same stages on this pen. I create a different solution to make, instead of the black being chunkier and more and thicker and larger, it's a little bit more on the thin side, and that allows for the marble effect. And you would apply, so if I were to do this style on this pen, it'll be easier to describe. So you have black on top of red. Well, then I would come back and paint red back over everything to level out the black and the red, sand it flat, and then you come with the orange and the yellow that you see in this pen.
For some highlights. And
then I did a Tamanuri with black urushi over the top of everything, and that's why you have all the different colorations to it.
Cool. And then you have some here that have some very distinct textures to them. Like what would that technique be called?
So the technique with where the purple is called ishime. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that one accurate. And it's is meant to be a stone-like texture. And the way this part is done is you apply a super wet layer of lacquer, so it's going to be on the thicker side. And then you take and the shimi powder is literally powdered urushi. So it's processed. It's something I purchased from my company not my company, but the company in Japan. It's already ready-made for me, and it's basically it's urushi lacquer that's been dried and then ground to grains of sand size pieces, and you sprinkle that all over the pen. And then because urushi is a natural adhesive as well, so everything will stick to it, lock itself in place, and then you add subsequent layers of purple to fill in the gaps, so to speak, but not all the way to the surface of everything, and then you just sand it down to knock off any sharp edges.
It seems like urushi can come in a number of different forms.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many application techniques for urushi, many of which I haven't yet to learn, many of which I've probably never seen or heard of before. I know many people are familiar, I know you are, with the Nakaya dorsal fin series, the 1 and the 2. The fin aspect of it is built up urushi lacquer mixed with a secondary, some people will use a type of clay that is mined in Japan. Some will use, like wheat.
But something to give it some strength.
Exactly.
Almost like adobe, to where there's like stuff like junk that's in the mud, so that it makes it stronger. Something like that.
Exactly, and it's a very specific recipe.
Yeah.
I don't know it, so I can't elaborate too much on it.
Now I know you're gonna start growing urushi trees in your backyard.
I wish
and start harvesting them every 8 years or whenever you could do that.
Right. I would love to. It would sure save some money. Because I mean, you have to imagine, urushi is naturally a brownish amber to start with.
Yeah.
Because it's literally the sap of the tree. There's refinement to it, but all that does is take out it takes out the water in the lacquer, so it concentrates and reduces, and it filters out particulates. They don't add anything to it.
So then when it comes to the different colors, the reds and blues and other colors,
Right.
what can you add to it that's in essence a natural substance to do that?
Right, and for the most part, it's always a natural pigment. I know there's no natural blue in nature, so I know that is probably a lake dye or something to that degree.
Yeah.
But I know with lots of the reds, it's cinnabar that they mix in, and they can mix in different natural pigments to create different colors. But at the same degree, it's always going to be somewhat finite because there's only so much you can add to it because you're always starting with a brown base color to start with.
Yeah.
That's why there's really not a natural white lacquer.
Is there really much difference in dealing with, we'll just call it a pure brown, as opposed to the ones that have the dyes and things in them?
Absolutely. They're much thicker to work with when you first get them. And through my conversations with the company I purchased everything from, they recommend mixing ratios of the natural, we call it Kai lacquer, into the pigmented and all that's doing, it's just loosening it up a little bit, allowing it to be painted more evenly. Because if you don't thin it out with the other lacquer, it becomes too thick, and your brush strokes won't level out.
Yeah. You know what? Something that I wanted to talk about this
Absolutely.
is we really didn't cover the technique of inlaying all this part.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's
Yeah,
okay,
right.
because we were talking about other things.
So on this particular one, I just purposely from the ground, because you have to remember you're working from the ground up. I didn't carve out the negative space. Instead, I just never painted it in the first place, and I never built up that layer with the powders.
Yeah.
So instead, I built up the ishime areas first, and then once I had that to the level I knew I was going to stop at, I then came in and started putting layers where all the abalone is to build up a base layer to then hand place each individual piece of abalone, and then add in and then paint over with the black lacquer to build up to the right depth.
I understand that everyone wants different creative outlets and things like this, but it seems like this is a much different skill set than, we'll just say, I don't want to say just making acrylics or just turning pens.
Right.
That it seems like it's a much, you're pulling on different things in your brain in order to do that. Is that something that you've always been interested in, or were you just looking for another creative outlet?
I've always been interested in things like this. It's getting into the pens, the pen making, the resins, and now this. I've got so much in my head that I never learned how to get out until I started into the pen industry, because it's the perfect medium. It's all tangible art, so it is to a degree something that you'll always find somebody that will fall in love with it. And there's such a aura around urushi lacquer that I was naturally drawn to it, much like a lot of other fountain pen collectors are, and I got so interested I wanted to give it a try. And I know there are several other people out there that do, and all I can say is do as much research as possible, and if you have specific questions, give me a hit, and I will see if I can help them out, because it is something that I know people want to try, people want to learn about, and I'm learning myself. I've only been doing this for about 5 years, and I probably have another decade worth of learning before I will ever say I'm qualified to teach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like this is a good, we'll almost call an entry-level urushi for folks.
Yes.
Compared to some of the Japanese craftsmen that do amazing work.
Oh, absolutely.
And incredible work that if you're looking to get involved more in comparative price to some of the other things that they're producing, that these are a little bit more reasonable.
Oh,
I'll say reasonable, but
no, I understand what you're saying, because when you look at the limited editions from Sailor, Pilot, Nakaya, etc., you're having a master's hand do that work.
This guy's been doing it, or woman, for 40, 50 years.
Exactly. And luckily one thing with me getting into this world is, so far I've been welcomed with open arms by everybody that is in that industry that I've met to this day. And I was worried a lot about that because I'm self-taught. I wasn't raised with the rules that if I were to apply for a school to be taught in a school in Japan, it's almost like the sushi masters in Japan. You have to wash dishes for 2 years before you can learn to cook the rice.
Yes.
And I skipped a lot of that because I have a young family, little daughter, and I can't leave to go to Japan for X amount of time. I don't think Shay would mind.
No,
Shay probably wouldn't mind. She'd probably be happy to have me go for a little while. But she's encouraged me to go to try and learn what I can, but at the same time, I know how much tradition matters, and I don't want to be disrespectful to that degree.
You don't want to come in there and say, hey, I have 3 days with you, teach me everything you know, and then I'm going to say that I'm taught by a Japanese master. And,
precisely, yes.
And that you have taught me everything that you know.
Yeah, I got the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there's different colors. Like this this one is more of a darker blue and black.
Exactly, and this is something I'm calling a marbled Tominari, and it's very similar to the style of this pen, only I do multiple colors of blue because this is also the dipping on the water method.
Yep.
But it's done in 3+ different colors of blue, and then one layer over the top of everything, and then sanded back down to flush, and it allows for this marbled coloration to come through.
Yeah. Now, do you find that is this one looks like it's on acrylic as opposed to ebonite, or am I mistaken?
No, that's
on ebonite.
This is black ebonite.
Do you find, because some of the pens that I reviewed before were on the clear acrylic,
right.
Do you find that there's a big difference between working with the acrylic and working with the ebonite?
Ebonite's honestly easier. It's more porous, and it adheres better. It levels out a little bit easier, and it's easier to sand between layers. I know that sounds weird, but the feel in the hand when it comes to sanding, it really does feel different. And also with the clear, this is the double-ended one you did the review on just a couple days ago. So with the clear aspects, especially if I'm doing just a Tominari over the top, you have to be so careful when it comes to painting on the layers over anything clear, because you're going to hold up to light, you're going to look through it, and if I don't do things very well, you're going to see streaks of brush strokes where I didn't apply it perfectly even. And I know, honestly, I never will perfectly apply it. I don't know many people that could, but at the same time, there's a difference between a small brush stroke versus gloppy, sloppy mess.
Yeah. And then it almost seems like the main reason for going through the acrylic is to have that translucency to it. And if you're not going to have that, then you might as well use ebonite, because it's going to work a little bit better.
Exactly. Yeah, this is more optimal to work with over the acrylics. And you like I said, you can do acrylics, and I am actually working on some at home that will be over just a regular black acrylic. There was a pen made by Conklin, I believe, that a customer sent me, asked me to do a finish on.
Is it possible to actually work the urushi into an acrylic? Not that I'm trying to make up new techniques for you.
To what degree exactly?
To where actually you're mixing it into with the instead of the dyes, actually literally mixing it in there, and so it's part of the acrylic. Would that even make sense?
I don't think it would make sense, only because I don't think it would ever cure properly.
Oh, okay.
Since it'll be encapsulated in resin, only any part that touches that it is exposed to the surface, only that minute part on the surface will cure. Everything within the resin will never cure.
Oh, okay. So that would be a bad idea.
Yeah,
that's why I'm not making Urushi pens, because that would be my first one.
Yes. But there are techniques where I saw at the Chicago show recently where it was, I believe, a Downing Trio pen that was made in buffalo horn, but it had maquille bats painted on it. So the only lacquer work on it were the bats. Everything else was exposed base material. It was beautiful.
And there's a variety of drying times that it takes for these. I've heard that some take a very long time to dry.
Absolutely. I don't have anything here to represent that. Any of the ones where I've said I have to apply a thick layer, I wait a week, sometimes 2. Mm-hmm. And there are some where it's taken over a month to cure. And those are, I'm going to try to pronounce it, Subaru Nuri or Karanuri is one of the more popular styles of that. And that is where you apply, first you mix the urushi with a thickening agent. Egg whites is one of the more popular ones, and you have to knead it together, and then when you put it on, you apply it in globules, is the best word I can think of, and you have to allow those to dry. Well, the times that I've tried it, after a month, they still weren't ready. After 2 months, they were finally ready, so somewhere in between that 30 to 60 day period, just for that one application processes to be done.
And because something I've heard, even with some of the pens coming over from Japan, just because you have the pen, technically it still might be even a little wet or not necessarily 100% cured. So maybe you don't want to like post them or other things or put undue stress in the body, because it still might be, it might be 99% dry, but it still might be somewhat pliable or somewhat malleable.
Exactly. And it just, urushi is I don't want to say a breathing, living being, but it does breathe. It cures by absorbing oxygen through humidity, or the oxygen and moisture in humidity. That's what allows it to cure. And yes, it'll always be absorbing. It'll always be curing to a degree. And it's when you don't respect it enough that if you try to rush it, yes, you can definitely come off. Somebody who's extremely allergic to poison ivies, they can be susceptible to it.
I have heard of people having reactions, and they've been very disappointed. Like they, waited a year to get their Nikaya, and they get it, and all of a sudden it has a reaction with their hand. Have you had any customers at all that have had reaction? Not that
only once. Once, and it was actually a nib grinder grinding a customer's pen that they've actually had for a few months. Yeah, and it turns out he is very allergic. So anytime that we work together on a customer's pen that it's going to have lacquer work to it, I just put the nib in a separate section and let them work on it with that, and then I'll handle all the lacquer. And I'm pretty sure the area that caused it is, and also with other pen manufacturers, is the threads. Especially if you lacquer your threads, you have to, the way I think of it is, yes, you're applying lacquer to your threads. Yes, it's been cured, but you're also putting in, especially if it's a screw cap, it's the caps inside the thread are basically grinding over that lacquer over and over and over, and it might go through to a bottom layer that might not have been cured 100%, and then yes, it could. Any kind of film or dust from that can transfer onto somebody's hand and cause a reaction.
Now, if you're lacquering the threads, and the threads are meant to be somewhat tight and fit very nicely within each other, but then when you're lacquering on top of that, then it messes with how the male and female are working together. And so how do you make the cap threads a little bit larger to accommodate for that, or what do you do?
The way I do it is I cut the threads on the body of the pen Let's get a good one. I will cut these threads just a little bit deeper, and that will allow just a little bit more room for that lacquer buildup. And that's the way I accomplish it when I work with Sean Newton a lot on commission pens. That he makes the pen, I do the lacquer work, then it goes to the customer.
Yep.
And since we know each other so well, I always say anytime you make a pen for lacquer, because he cuts his threads on the lathe, just cut those a little bit deeper, and then also behind the threads, if there's a step here, especially on his Shinobi model, to recess the cap just a hair more, allowing me to build up the lacquer behind the threads before the shoulder of the body.
So has there been a technique that you've really grown fond of that you want to specialize in, or do you really like kind of hitting a number of different techniques?
So far, I'm enjoying hitting a different number. I'm always trying something new. I'll either have a thought in my head that I want to experiment with, or else I try not to look too much online to get too much inspiration, because I don't want to copy per se. I want it to come from my head. And then later on, if I see, like, say, hey, this Nakai had a similar finish, like, okay, I see how they did it, and I think I can improve mine after what I saw.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, this is something that I've seen. I cannot remember which company did it, but I have seen this style done by another pen lacquer artist.
I've seen the Kaya ones to where it's almost like a fissure type, almost like a crack.
Yes, the Nagoro style.
Yeah, and I think in a way that's kind of the same technique,
right,
or something somewhat similar to that. So what's next? If you're mastering Urushi, then do you find yourself wanting to move on to something different or something unique, or is this an end game for you, or there's enough of a playground here to keep you busy for quite some time?
There's going to be enough time with this for decades, I'm sure, that will keep me more than busy. It definitely won't be the end game. I'm sure I will find something else that I want to try out and play around with. But honestly, I have so much fun doing this. So many ideas I want to try out. I'm going to be super fine staying in this world for a long time, as long as other people are loving it, and I don't have to keep everyone for myself. I'll be fine.
How do you balance this between your other product line of, we'll just call it straight acrylic pens,
right,
that you're turning?
It's hard. It definitely is. Because you also have to add in the resin making for all the other companies.
That's a whole business in its own.
I work 3 full-time jobs, and I still have to be a father and a husband, and it is very difficult to manage my time day to day. Luckily, my daughter's still young. She's still in preschool, so when she's gone to school, I'm home working. When we get home, I can do some office work, play with her some. And while Shay's at work, or when Shay's off work, those are my full days, I call them, where I usually do resins in the morning, resin casting in the morning, resin pens in the afternoon, and then have dinner with the family. And then once they both go to bed around 10 o'clock, I start lacquer work, and I stay on this till 2, 3 in the morning. And this is 7 days a week.
So you have enough to keep you busy right now?
Yes. The demand is definitely there right now. On resin pens alone, my backlog is almost a year out now. On Urushi pens, I work these in to make the ebonite pens whenever I have what I call my free time, where if I were to make something for inventory, for a show, or for the website, or just for myself for fun, that time is then put towards making the ebonite pens for commissioned lacquer work.
Yeah.
And because I can't fathom telling somebody, well, it'll be 11 months for me to make the ebonite pen, and then you need to give me another 3 to 5 months for the lacquer work. So I work those pens in, like I said, whenever that free time allows, and then it is however long to do that application process for what they specifically want.
So it seems like the quickest way, if someone really wanted to get one of your Urushi pens, is to probably hit you up at a show.
Most likely, yes. And as you can see here, I always try to have a variety of different styles, different looks, different colors, techniques, etc. That way, someone can find something that they want and love.
So, Jonathan, if someone wanted to check out your work, where would they go to, and where could they actually order some of these things?
CarolinaPenCompany.com is the website, and on the website there's several different areas to look at everything: materials, pens, urushi, etc. A custom order form, price guides for both lacquer work and resin work, and there's also at the very bottom a link to my Instagram account where you see, I can't say daily pictures or videos, but you can see a lot of in-progress stuff and as well as finished products.
And I've ordered a pen from you before on commission, and so when you order a pen from someone, it's a process and you start a conversation.
Absolutely.
It is not just give me option A, B, C, D, enter, and then it's done.
No, not at all. On the order form, it'll ask you some pertinent questions: what model you might want, material, if you have specific requests, if you want lacquer work or any of the other specialty finishes. And all that gives me is a basic outline of what you're wanting, so I can communicate back, ask any questions, have a back and forth conversation for 1-2 emails usually, and then we go through the finalizing process of completing the order.
Well, Jonathan, I wanted to thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I've enjoyed learning a little bit more about urushi, and real anxious to see the things that you have coming up in the future, because it always seems like you have something new and
Always.
something different.
Thank you for having me.
We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, David.